And here we go again. Attacks on religious freedom in America. America's tradition of religious freedom. Religious freedom has long been considered America's first freedom. America's founders prominently enshrined it in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. In its infancy, however, the United States consisted of colonies committed to certain Christian denominations such as Congregational, Presbyterian, Baptist, or Anglican. Religious freedom was extended only as far as each colony's established denomination would allow. Each denomination lobbied to be the officially recognized religion, and some colonies made the relationship with the colonial government official. In Virginia, for example, Anglicans paid their priests with tax dollars, and dissenters were often persecuted. All of this changed in the course of just a few years. The Baptist evangelist John Leland was instrumental in making it happen. He influenced Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who in turn advocated strongly for religious freedom at the First Congress. Together, they had it in their power to begin the world over again, as Thomas Paine so eloquently expressed it in Common Sense. Fanning the religious freedom spark into a fire, the British Parliament sought to increase the Anglican Communion's influence in the American colonies. Many founders were alarmed. If Parliament was willing to diminish religious freedom, then all freedom was at risk. John Adams said this apprehension contributed as much as any cause to the corroding of America's loyalty to Britain, leading directly to the American Revolution. To secure religious freedom, our founders refused to establish a national church and instead constitutionally guaranteed a free market of religion, which led to both greater freedom and also greater devotion. According to Brian Grimm and Roger Fink, the rate of church adherence increased from 17% of the population in 1776 to 51% by 1890. Behind the founders' actions was a belief that restrictions on religious freedom would lead to restrictions on other freedoms. Even while recognizing that nations around the world had official state churches and still protected religious freedom, American deists and Christians united on these 5 points in establishing the United States of America. 1. State-sanctioned churches should be disestablished. 2. A creator God was the guarantor of fundamental human rights. 3. Human sinfulness posed a threat to polity, especially via the power of the state. 4. A republic needed to be sustained by virtue on the part of ordinary citizens. 5. God/providence moved in and through the work of particular nations. Nowhere else in the world was the effort to secure religious freedom so robust. America's founders intentionally limited government's power in religious matters. They heeded the words of British political leader Lord Acton that power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Just as freedom of the press entails the state respecting the press's sphere of authority, religious freedom entails the state respecting the church's sphere of authority. Interestingly, the founders based their convictions about religious freedom on principles that were aligned with the Bible, were derived only from the Bible, or were self-evident but justified only by the Bible: the soul's immortality, divine judgment, providential acts, the sin nature, moral absolutes, the human capacity to bear God's image, order in the universe, public virtue, and the general teachings of the Bible. America's founders had little doubt that these beliefs formed the link between public virtue and national success. This in turn grounded their belief in limited government, just war, and the importance of Christian influence in national life. Now, a growing divide on these principles is making it easier for the government to begin choking out religious freedom, not by threatening physical safety, but through bureaucracy. In early 2012, when the Obama administration first announced that the Department of Health and Human Services, or DHS, as part of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, would force employers to provide contraceptive and abortion drugs to employees at no cost, alarm bells rightly went off among both Catholics and Protestants. The Christian owners of Hobby Lobby, a private for-profit business, successfully challenged the government's mandate, but non-profits still face heavy fines if they refuse to pay for abortion drugs for their employees as part of their insurance coverage. These fines of up to $36,500 per person per year are monstrous compared to the $2,000 a year fine for not providing health insurance at all. In essence, organizations face ruin if they fail to comply with the administration's pro-abortion stance. For instance, in the year the mandate was pronounced, the organization Let's try this. In essence, organizations face ruin if they fail to comply with the administration's pro-abortion stance. For instance, in the year the mandate was pronounced, the organization I lead had 36 employees. We would have faced fines of more than $1.3 million per year. The ministry would have been shut down. Is it really so burdensome for people to buy their own contraceptives that businesses and ministries must be forced to pay for them? Yet these mandates have reached absurd lengths. The Little Sisters of the Poor, a group of elderly Catholic nuns who take a vow of poverty to serve the elderly poor, were told that they must provide contraceptives to their members as part of their health care plan. The court said they must sign a waiver to be exempted, but this waiver would instruct a third-party provider to provide the services they object to. This is like forcing a pacifist who objects to war to pay for someone to go to war in his place. It violates the very principle the freedom is intended to protect. I once asked Eric Metaxas why religious liberty was a big deal. Eric, whose book Bonhoeffer is the source for the story told in the politics chapter of this book about the minister martyred for standing against Hitler's tyranny, explained that in Nazi Germany, the abuses against the Jews started out as small bureaucratic rule changes. When no one objected, the Nazis pushed harder, destroying more freedoms. Eric ended up saying, "You can't sit this one out. This is where you have to draw the line." Meanwhile, the rise of the same-sex marriage issue will continue putting private citizens in an untenable position. Politicians promise to protect religious rights of clergy, promises that in a similar situation in Canada has proved empty. But non-clergy Christians are being sued for choosing not to provide services that run counter to their religious convictions. For example, Catholic Charities in Massachusetts had to close its doors because it wouldn't facilitate adoptions by same-sex couples, even though other adoption agencies in Massachusetts would facilitate them. In this vein, Focus on the Family president Jim Daly relates a disturbing conversation he had with Ch Feldblum, one of 3 commissioners for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which regulates employment practices and thus has an enormous influence in both business and government. Daly asked, "Ch, tell me what a perfect world for you would look like." Feldblum replied, "Well, if I wanted to get married to my partner and a Christian person was working at the county courthouse, if they refused to do it, even politely, and had somebody else come over to do it, she shouldn't work, or he shouldn't work in the county courthouse. What about a doctor that wouldn't do in vitro fertilization for a lesbian couple? Well, they should never be licensed by the state because they would be violating my rights." When Daly questioned whether this would violate religious liberty, Feldblum told him that her sexual rights trump religious freedom. Feldblum represents the crowning triumph of secularism in the public sphere. As David Nobel and I demonstrate in Understanding the Times, secularism isn't just a political viewpoint. It's a religion that denies God's relevance to life. In essence, a new religion of self-worship has seized the helm and is steering the ship of state into the uncharted waters of total liberation, even if it requires plowing through a few vital but fragile freedoms along the way. The trend toward elected officials and unelected bureaucrats ignoring constitutional boundaries continues. In a 2012 interview, Chick-fil-A CEO Dan Cathy affirmed his support for the biblical view of marriage. Within days of Cathy's interview, Boston Mayor Thomas Menino vowed to block any efforts by the fast food chain to move into his city, but later backtracked. Chicago Alderman Joe Moreno, with an attitude worthy of the Chicago bosses of old, also promised to do everything in his power to stop a Chick-fil-A from opening in his ward, even as one was in the licensing process to do that very thing. He later backtracked as well. In 2015, based on Cathy's stance on marriage, Denver City Councilman Paul Lopez opposed allowing Chick-fil-A to open a restaurant at Denver International Airport, calling it a moral issue. In the end, the council approved the license, but only after a nationwide outcry from free speech advocates. Non-government attacks on religious freedom in America. Archbishop Charles Chaput of Philadelphia says that compared to almost anywhere else in the world, our religious freedom situation is good, but the situation is changing. Chaput notes, because people use words like justice, rights, freedom, and dignity without any commonly shared meaning to their content. As a result, our most important debates boiled down to who can deploy the best words in the best way to get power. At the time of this writing, the greatest threats to religious freedom in America come from activists who think sexual expression, particularly acceptance of same-sex marriage, should trump all other freedoms and rights. Princeton professor Robert George writes that activists are giddy with success and urged on by a compliant and even gleeful media. Eric Metaxas says, the message is clear. Not only should Christians remain silent about gay marriage, if we know what's good for us, but we must be made to agree with and even celebrate what Scripture calls sin. Case in point, in a rambling burst of newspeak, New York Times columnist Frank Bruni informed Christians that it's time to bow to the enlightenments of modernity, and in the words of gay philanthropist Mitchell Gold, take homosexuality off of the sin list. Backing these activists are major foundations funded with business profits, pouring millions of dollars into efforts to reframe the issue of religious liberty as one right among many, and not necessarily as the first freedom American founders envisioned it to be. One such project is called the Public Rights Private Conscience Project, hosted by the Columbia University Law School. Then there is the tyranny of the majority. Thanks to social media, negative stories planted in the press have accused Christians standing for religious liberty of being anti-gay bigots. As a result, support for religious freedom has dipped. A study undertaken by the First Amendment Center in 2000 found nearly 73% of Americans agreeing that the freedom to worship as one chooses applies to all religious groups, regardless of how extreme their beliefs are. Just 7 years later, that number dropped to 56%. Even if these dips are temporary, they give political cover to those who oppose religious freedom. Businesses have become ground zero for such religious freedom conflicts. In early 2015, the Indiana legislature passed a state version of the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which Congress passed decades ago and President Bill Clinton signed into law. A coordinated effort by same-sex marriage advocates painted the decision as bigotry and a religious right to discriminate. Buoyed by a social media campaign, businesses like Apple, Walmart, Eli Lilly, Angie's List, and others put immense pressure on lawmakers, who subsequently caved in to activists' demands. It was a cynical move. After all, companies like Apple do business in such countries as Uganda, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Nigeria, where homosexuals receive the death penalty. Political science professor Patrick Deneen wrote, "The decision to boycott Indiana was not made because it was the politically courageous thing to do. It was made because it was the profitable thing to do." Deneen concluded by saying that this libertarian indifference, left unchecked, will ultimately give wealthy companies the power to set the national agenda without respect to culture, place, or morality. The mix of homosexual activism, profit, and government pressure whipped up through a carefully designed social media campaign shows how easily citizens can be swept up into a technological version of a torchlight mob, complete with self-righteous social media posts serving as digital pitchforks. In such a world, we should worry not about middle-of-the-night secret police raids, but about the middle-of-the-day click-clack of the power-drunk bloggers and bureaucrats' keyboards. Christians need to care and act. Let's discuss 2 reasons why and 4 things Christians can do. Section 3. Why should Christians care? God cares about the oppressed. Jesus sets spiritual captives free with real-world effects. In fact, Jesus began his public ministry reading the following passage in a synagogue. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed. Jesus was quoting Isaiah 61, which seems to deal with literal captives, not just spiritual captives. Thus, he connected humanity's spiritual condition and physical condition in a new way. No longer helplessly bound to sin, individual lives begin to change. Society changes too. As Jesus puts it in John 8, you shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. The Jewish people would have been well aware of how Jesus' words dovetailed with their rich tradition of being set free. The prophet Isaiah said, Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house when you see the naked, to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh? Indeed, the story of the Hebrew nation began with a quest for religious freedom. The book of Exodus opens with Egypt's new king deciding to oppress God's chosen people. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. In response, God sent Moses to liberate them. Behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Moses' initial appeal to Pharaoh was for freedom of worship. The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. Pharaoh's growing resistance to Hebrew freedom was eventually broken through an increasingly severe cycle of plagues. Exodus tells a thrilling story of God rescuing the Hebrews from one disaster after another, leading them to freedom and flourishing. Why does God care so much about the oppressed? Because every person bears his image, even slaves. We see this in the book of Job, where Job recognized that his bondservants were just as much image bearers of God as he was, and that he would have to answer to God if he mistreated them. The Old Testament law makes provisions for the care and protection of slaves in Exodus 11, 12, and 21, Leviticus 19, 22, and 25, and Deuteronomy 5, 15, 16, and 21. As the Bible's story unfolds, it becomes clear that all are one through faith in Christ Jesus, no matter their role in life. The Apostle Paul appealed to Philemon to treat the slave Onesimus as a brother, condemns trading humans as cargo, echoing Ezekiel 27. 1 Timothy 1 condemns enslavers, people who forced humans into slavery. Throughout history, Christians inspired by Jesus' focus on setting captives free have provided the basis for anti-slavery movements, human rights, and the protection of the vulnerable. Religious freedom is essential for sustaining a free and virtuous society. Brian Grimm and Roger Fink found that religious freedom is inextricably linked with the overall well-being of a society. The decline of religious freedom is correlated with a decline of gross domestic product and foreign investment, an increase in inflation, and an erosion of democracy. The American founders' hypothesis appears to be right. Apart from its inherent value, religious freedom secures other liberties, and by checking the powers of the state, enables human flourishing. These freedoms are being eroded today. According to Grimm and Fink, clues of growing government restriction include the requirement that particular religious groups register with the government, limits on the freedom to worship, restrictions on foreign missionaries, and regulations against proselytizing. Much of this is happening right now, but restrictions on religious freedom don't have to stand. There are things we can do to make a difference. Section 4, what should we do? Forsake a gospel of abandonment. Many Christians believe that their faith is a matter of personal preference and has nothing to do with what is going on in the world. They would agree with the description of faith provided by historian Theodore Roszak as socially irrelevant, even if privately engaging. Christianity became this way because many church leaders in the past taught that it deals with the interpersonal world, not the external public world. As historian Richard Pierre observed, the external world was often seen as irrelevant to Christianity belief because it operated on nature, scientific knowledge, and statecraft, and operated on the basis of its own internal logic and discernible laws. As one 19th century theologian put it, the gospel has absolutely nothing to do with outward existence, but only with eternal life, not with external orders and institutions, which would come in conflict with the secular orders, but only with the heart and its relationship with God. This is a counterfeit Christianity. Those who wonder how so many Christian people could blindly follow Adolf Hitler need to look no further than a theology that groomed an entire generation of Christians to be weak-minded and easily fooled. Christians today are often similarly disengaged. In the last few presidential elections, approximately 40% of evangelical Christians didn't vote. They chose comfort over liberty, unaware that such a choice spells death for both. Historian Gary DeMar warns that the church's refusal to be the conscience of the nation makes it a poor refuge when persecution strikes. The day may come when the state starts attacking you and me. While our churches might speak out against the action of the state, he says, they might not intervene to save us. As we saw in chapter 12, without accountability, the state tends toward lawlessness and disorder. The church's job is to help the state remember to protect the innocent and punish evil. As Eric Metaxas puts it, it is the church's role to help the state be the state. To preserve religious freedom, the state will need to reassert this role. In the past, Christians willingly did so. In fact, when missionaries went to spread the gospel, they brought freedom with them. Sociologist Robert Woodbury has found that the single most important determining factor for whether an emerging country had a functioning, modern, liberal democracy, a working education system, and economic stability was the presence of conversionary Protestant missionaries in the 19th century. Controlling for all other variables, this was the overwhelmingly important factor that led to stable states rather than dictatorships or theocracies. And many clergy played a key role in defending the rights of Native people. Historian Kenneth Stewart says that while not all clergy supported the rights of Native people, no one other than the clergy defended their human rights. In many ways, the development of what we call international law today began with the work of two Spanish theologians, Francisco de Vitoria and Domingo de Soto. Another strong advocate for native rights was Bartolomé de las Casas. As a young man, Las Casas came to the New World and participated in abuses and atrocities against the Native Americans. Challenged by Dominican friars about this, he eventually concluded that the Spanish treatment of the natives was deeply wrong, and he dedicated his life to fighting for their rights. Las Casas lobbied the royal court of Spain to end enslavement of natives, the central cruelty and abuse inflicted on them. Initially, he advocated for the use of African slaves, though he later changed course and worked to protect them as well. Las Casas was motivated by his faith. Along with everything else, he was concerned about evangelizing the natives and knew they would be receptive only if they were freed from coercion and abuse. The gospel should be freely preached and freely accepted or rejected. Defend religious freedom. Politicians who refuse to grant business licenses because they don't like the political or religious beliefs of the business owners need to be held accountable. It's the very violation of freedom of conscience that America's founders sought to avoid. Fortunately, many legal organizations have now organized to fight back. These include Alliance Defending Freedom and the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. Alliance Defending Freedom has defended hundreds of businesses and ministries. The Becket Fund played a key role in the 9-0 Supreme Court decision in Hosanna Tabor Evangelical Lutheran Church and School versus Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which recognized for the first time that religious organizations have the constitutional right to choose their own ministries, free from government interference or manipulation. ADF and the Becket Fund are good organizations to watch because they know not only how to fight hard but also how to fight fair. Coercion and religiously motivated violence aren't valid options according to the teachings of Jesus, nor is using the coercive powers of the state to promote or defend the church or to attack dissenters. The state may and must respond to violence, but it should not use force against ideas. Jesus tells us that we're to give to Caesar what is rightfully his, but we must reserve for God the things that belong to him, which includes our consciences. In standing for their own religious liberty, Catholics and Protestants also must not fail to stand for the religious freedom of Muslims, Jews, Latter-day Saints, and other religious groups. As Robert George puts it, the first and more important reason is simply that it is the right thing to do. Faith and reason bear common witness to the profound truth that religious liberty is a right held equally by all. The second reason is that the denial of religious liberty for any one group erodes the foundations of religious liberty for everyone. Christians can also advocate for religious freedom in other countries. It starts by knowing what violations are occurring. One organization calling attention to religious persecution around the world is Voice of the Martyrs, founded by Richard Wurmbrand, a Romanian pastor imprisoned for 14 years and tortured for preaching the gospel. Americans can hold their government accountable to advocate for the persecuted in other nations as well. One avenue is the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. This commission regularly reviews countries of particular concern that discriminate based on religion. The federal government has the power to warn and even impose economic sanctions on countries that do this, but whether they do depends on the priorities of those in charge. For example, Saudi Arabia, which blatantly violates principles of religious freedom, has been given a waiver based on its promise to reform, a promise it hasn't yet carried out. The United States gains a lot trading economically with Saudi Arabia. Are we willing to overlook blatant persecution to keep the money flowing? As long as those who care about religious freedom are silent, nothing will change. Christians can play a particularly important role by impressing the importance of religion when communicating with government officials. 84% of the people in the world are religious. To overlook the role of religion is to remain purposefully ignorant about what is really going on. In their ignorance, U.S. officials in a position to help the persecuted have often looked away. When speaking of Nigeria's brutal anti-Christian Boko Haram organization, whose name means Western education is a sin, and whose fighters have killed more than 13,000 civilians, Johnny Carson, the U.S. State Department Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, asserted, "Religion is not driving extremist violence in northern Nigeria." Stay clear about what the real issue is. Denver cake shop owner Jack Phillips, Masterpiece Cake Shop, refused a gay couple when they asked him to make a wedding cake for their upcoming same-sex wedding. Judge Robert N. Spencer said that under Colorado's public accommodation law, Phillips did not have the right to refuse the couple service. This is so, even though same-sex marriage wasn't legal in Colorado at the time of the refusal. The case generated strong opinions on both sides. The media largely portrayed the baker as an anti-gay person, but the point was missed in all the furor. It wasn't about whether Phillips would serve gay customers, which he had always done. Rather, it was about being asked to participate in a ceremony honoring a particular kind of relationship he deemed immoral. Many homosexual activists cheered the decision to punish Phillips, but pro-homosexual advocate Andrew Sullivan was not among them. I would never want to coerce any fundamentalist to provide services for my wedding, or anything else for that matter, if it made them in any way uncomfortable. The idea of suing these businesses to force them to provide services they are clearly uncomfortable providing is anathema to me. I think it would be repellent to the gay rights movement as well. You won't hear that a lot. It's not just that Christians want the right to believe that man-woman marriage is biblical, it's that they defend the very idea of man-woman marriage. As we saw in our chapter on marriage, the biblical worldview is that, as English professor Mark Bauerlein explains, some souls in the world are caught in troubled, disordered desires, and if we accept those desires, we allow disorder in family and society, and we act contrary to God's will. The issue isn't just the freedom to assemble for worship. It's the right to advocate ideas that might even be politically unpopular, and to do so with like-minded people. When this kind of freedom is abridged, freedom itself is in jeopardy. Conclusion. In a scene from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Two Towers, Pippin and Merry entreat the peace-loving Ents to join the battle against the evil Sauron. When the trees refuse, Pippin comforts Merry by saying, "Maybe Treebeard's right. We don't belong here, Merry. It's too big for us. What can we do in the end? We've got the Shire. Maybe we should go home." Merry replies with desperation in his voice, "The fires of Isengard will spread, and the woods of Tookborough and Buckland will burn, and all that was once great and good in this world will be gone." Mary's understanding should resonate with contemporary Christians. It may seem as if freedom will inevitably fail. If we refuse to act while we still have the freedom to speak our minds, there may come a day when the power plays of political correctness will eliminate our liberties, and all that was once great and good about the land of the free will cease to exist. Feeling helpless isn't a good excuse for doing nothing, though. As Dutch theologian and statesman Abraham Kuyper once said, "As soon as principles gain ground that are contrary to your deepest convictions, then resistance is your duty and acquiescence is a sin." Of course, in many cases, persecution nurtures the spread of the gospel. While imprisoned in Iran, American Christian Saeed Abedini continued sharing his faith. Thousands of young Iranians have come to Christ in the past decade and are starting churches. It isn't without cost, however. Nagma and Saeed paid the cost. Their children suffered. Their marriage suffered. But as Saeed wrote to his 8-year-old daughter, "People die and suffer for their Christian faith all over the world, and some may wonder why. But you should know the answer of why is who. It is for Jesus. He is worth the price." In the coming years, it may be costly to follow Christ, even in America, but those who love freedom must stand. As the 19th century abolitionist Wendell Phillips is thought to have written, "Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. The light of freedom must remain lit. Often throughout history, it has been lit by the sacrifice of those who have gone to their deaths out of love for their Savior. Before the Catholic Queen Mary of England commanded the Bishop Hugh Latimer be burned at the stake, he was said to have proclaimed to his fellow sufferer, Bishop Nicholas Ridley, Be of good cheer, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle in England as I hope by God's grace shall never be put out. May we have the courage to keep the flame of religious liberty lit throughout the world.